Hey everybody. Um, I realize there's no exam, but I thought, you know what, I just take the time to maybe tie some ideas together that we've been discussing, or trying to deal with in the course. I mean, not being able to meet with you in class really limits my ability to kind of touch on some of these topics, right? Because I realize, you guys are limited in what you're able to do, and just being in the space you're in, where you're at home. And anyway, long story short, but I wanted to offer you this screencast just as a way to tie together some of the ideas of the hero that we've been talking about, and how they relate from Beowulf to Sir Gawain, to King Lear. So I hope this is helpful. You do not aren't going to have to really know any of this for any test or anything like that, but I feel like this may enlighten you a little bit. It may help with your essays or some of the questions that you're answering. But again, this is really just optional. So yeah, so some ideas to keep in mind, tracing back through Beowulf, Gawain, and King Lear, and I'll also touch on the Dark Knight, which we began the course with. So uh, there's a book called The Empathic Civilization, which is a really interesting book. It's written by a guy named Jeremy Rifkin, who's a well-known American academic. And so, in order to talk about this discussion, I think it's important to talk about what a civilization is, what a culture is, what a society is, and I hopefully you'll see the connection as we go along. But Rifkin argues that as societies develop, they become less homogeneous and more diverse. And those of you who take science will know that homogeneous just means alike. So a homogeneous solution or a homogeneous mixture would be a solution, something in which you can't really see or distinguish the various different parts. They're all kind of mixed together. A heterogeneous solution would be one where the parts are easily identifiable. And societies work like this. They start out being heterogeneous, so there's a lot of different distinct groups, and this is like England in Anglo-Saxon times. You had Picts and Celts and Bretons and the Welsh, and you had all these different sort of people groups that were isolated in various areas. But as the centuries went on, these groups started to merge together until what came about was a kind of more or less homogenous sort of English, in air quotes, society. In Beowulf's day, kinship, lineage, blood ties, they were really important. So, who your father was, who your sons were, that kind of thing. Your family lineage was very important. And as societies develop, these things tend to become less important. And the other kind of trend that occurs is that eventually the focus is more on individual rights, more on focuses more on the importance of individuals as opposed to the importance of maintaining the integrity of the group. So in Beowulf's day, the goal was to maintain this fledgling society and keep it from being broken apart by invasions and internal conflict. And so everything was focused on creating stability. Once that stability has been created and the society's become much more homogenous, there is a social identity, then individuals become more important. So if you look at modern culture, you can see this trend, right? Technology has created a kind of global village. So we live in a world that is, although it's made of different countries, different languages, different ethnic backgrounds, there's a real homogeneity to it because we're all digitally connected. This began with radio at the beginning of the 20th century. It was enhanced further by television. And then the internet has just completely revolutionized the way that we relate to one another, the way we do business, the way politics occurs, entertainment, all that sort of thing the technology, and particularly the internet, has created a kind of homogeneity. It's also been helped by faster travel and communications. So in 1850, the fastest object on Earth was a ship. So the fact, and before you had wireless telegraphy or even wired telegraphy, news could only travel as fast as the fastest vehicle, which was a ship. So it might take weeks for something that happened in Europe to make its way to North America. It certainly wouldn't happen, in seconds the way it happens today. Um, our notion of community is much broader than it was in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, community was the village you lived in. And even if you lived in a city of London, which might have had a population of 300,000 or something in 1450, even within that 300,000, your community would really probably be the street or streets, immediately or surrounding your own dwelling. If you lived in the country, then community would become smaller. And what was important, or what's important in our culture, is inclusion. In the Middle Ages and earlier, it was much more about exclusion. So now it's about how can we get more people included in our groups, right? And so we talk about disability, and we talk about mental health, and we talk about cultural, assimilation, and we talk about how similar we are to one another. In the Middle Ages, it was much more about how do we exclude people who are different. So you had witch hunts, and you had Jews being excluded or being sent out of England, and so you had this idea of let's keep everybody the same, and exclude people who are different. And now it's the opposite. We want to include as many different people as possible. So that's a major characterization of earlier civilizations that's no longer really true. Now, of course, it is true in some cultures, but we tend to view those cultures that are still exclusionary as rather backward from a Western point of view. We look at society, say in the Middle East, which subjugate women or persecute people based on their religious affiliations or sexual orientation or all these other things. We tend to look at those countries as not as progressive as we are now. So if we switch this idea over, this movement from an exclusionary society to an inclusionary society, and we go back to Beowulf, we can see this development as we go up through Gawain and Lear. So in Beowulf, it was a lineal exclusionary social order, and by lineal I mean based on who your parents were, what your bloodline was, your kinship ties. And the major threat in Beowulf was outside influences or outside threats. So the Beowulf poet is trying to create and maintain a kind of ethnic religious identity, English Christianity, which at this point was still basically being invented. And he was trying to kind of create a space for that within this context in which there were a lot of different factions, different groups, as I mentioned before. People who were not, part of this, or people who were seen as not potentially a part of this, were seen as hostile. They were dangerous. They were contaminating factors, not just socially, militarily, in that way, but also increasingly spiritually. So Christianity was under attack from other points of view, like paganism and that sort of thing. This is in Beowulf's society. The society tended to be aggressive, and we've talked a little bit about that. And by aggressive, I simply mean that life was nasty, brutish, and short, and a lot of your life was spent trying to stave off death, and usually death at the hands of some hostile enemy who didn't share your particular perspective, your religion or your cultural values, etc. So, right, you have all these people groups that are known in this period of history as being aggressive, violent, colonial, in the sense that they were trying to kind of attack and raid and take over. A quick way to say this is simply that the enemy was without. The enemy was outside, and your culture's job was to circle the wagons and prevent the enemy from becoming an enemy within. By the time we get to Gawain and Chaucer, so we've fast forward 400 years, um, you had the development of the romantic hero. Beowulf, of course, was an epic hero based on loosely on Greek and Roman epic hero characters. By the time Sir Gawain and Chaucer come around, 400 years has passed, and so some of that heterogeneous uh, some of the heterogeneous characteristics of the society were starting to become muted. So England was becoming a more homogenous society. There were some more shared cultural values. The distinguishing characteristics of the different people groups were less obvious. Um, it was diverse, but it had a stronger centralized identity than Beowulf. So the idea of being English was something people understood in Chaucer's day, whereas that was by no means guaranteed in Beowulf's day. Some of the examples of this would be by Chaucer's day, you had a common language, so you didn't have some people speaking Saxon and others speaking Welsh and others speaking, um, other various different dialects and languages of the original British people. You had a centralized government, so you didn't have 7 Saxon kingdoms that might have different rules. The heptarchy, you had a king governing an entire country over which the laws applied more or less kind of uniformly. There was there was an increase in literacy that was growing. That wasn't really true until later in the 15th century, after the invention of the printing press. There was a common currency, and so this English identity was much stronger 400 years after Beowulf. Add to this code of chivalry, centered around Arthur, centered around knightly behaviors, like that exemplified in Gawain, was a more or less kind of formal way or literary way to embed some of the values that the Beowulf poet was going for in writing the poem. So chivalry became a kind of social thing that embodied some of these literary values that showed up in some of these stories. Chaucer's Knight is a little snapshot of that kind of thing, but Gawain is really a whole story about chivalry. Threats were still mostly external. So, the main threat to any kingdom would be a war with some other kingdom. The 100 Years' War with France was an example of this, where England and France were fighting constantly over a period of, it was over 100 years, but it was known as the 100-Year War. But what you saw in the literature was internal threats were beginning to emerge. And in Gawain, obviously, it's his internal struggle against temptation, etc. In the wider culture, you had things like witch hunts. So the idea that these witches were among us, they were corrupting us, and God was punishing us through the plague. Right? The plague was a punishment on people who had fallen away from the true Catholic faith, and so there's witches, and so they hunted the witches. There was a peasant revolt in the 1380s where people rose up against what they saw to be an unjust system, where the poor were kept poor and the wealthy were wealthy. So that was a really important moment in English history where the social order, feudalism, was really under threat, but it was under threat from within. So people within the culture were posing a threat against the stability of the social system, of the nobility, etc. The monarchy became weakened. So Magna Carta in 1215 was an example of this, where the barons got together and they basically forced King John to sign this document guaranteeing that he would follow the rules. He wouldn't just do what he wanted. So this was, a huge moment where the people forced the monarchy to kind of play fair to a certain extent. Of course, John immediately turned around and went back on his word, but the point being, this document was drawn up and it existed. It became the kind of the nucleus of English common law, and we are still, we still have elements of Magna Carta embedded in our legal system. Um, so if you look at Gawain as a character, he is a kind of he's almost a symbol. Like he has human character. I mean, he's much more three-dimensional than Beowulf was, but he still has this symbolic element to him, where he's sort of an embodiment of personal courage, morality, humility. These kind of five virtues: friendship, loyalty, uh, chastity, etc. Right. And if you think about his quest, in this case, his quest with against the Green Knight, Gawain is a character that shows up in a number of stories, and he has a number of different quests. But his quests are kind of metaphors for the challenges that faced England as a country. And they share a couple of characteristics. They're both physical and external in some sense, right? So the Green Knight is a physical threat. He's a moral threat. He's a spiritual threat, but primarily he's a physical threat. I mean, Gawain doesn't want to die. Morgan Le Fay is, she's behind it, but her agenda is not physical damage. Her agenda is moral, cultural, spiritual damage. She wants to show that Arthur is not what he says he is, that Camelot is not this idyllic kingdom, etc. And then on a really simple level, you still have the ogres, the monsters, the dragons, the things that Beowulf fought, but they're less important in this story than they were in Beowulf. Beowulf, Grendel's mother, the dragon, they were central characters. In Gawain, they're sort of afterthoughts. But the conflicts are also internal, and you could argue that in a way, Gawain's biggest battle is his own fear, his fear of violating the rules of chivalry by giving in to Lady Bertilac, his fear of death, which causes him to break his oath with Sir Bertilac and lie about the Green Garter. He's battling his own tendency to be selfish, to be self-protecting, to be, in a sense, sinful. And so this is a message that was central to the culture as well. If the culture is going to survive these growing threats from within, then English people have to have a moral compass. They have to have an inner strength. They have to have conviction and self-discipline and all these things that Gawain needed to possess in order to triumph against the Green Knight. Gawain is known as a romantic hero, and it has to do with the fact that he's a guy of adventure. He has an adventurous spirit. And up until the late 19th century, the word romance really didn't have anything to do with love and sex and marriage, really. I mean, it did, but it was primarily about adventures like Gawain's. Romance meant adventure. There were love elements of it, but it was a very symbolic kind of love. So Gawain's dedication to the Virgin Mary, a typical knight's dedication to his lady, all of which wouldn't have been sexual, really. They would have been really metaphors for the average person's devotion to Mary, religious devotion. So chivalry was kind of a shadow Christianity, where the knight was an image of the average person, and the knight's dedication to his lady was, the average person's dedication to Mary, and that sort of thing. So you had both of these characteristics, an external threat like in Beowulf, but growingly and increasingly a more internal kind of threat.